So the first order of business is next month, the second Thursday is on Valentine's Day. So everybody better be here. No. We're moving it to the 21st, so the following Thursday. And we will be presenting on unit tests. And then, was there anything else, or is that it?
I think that's it.
So people have signed up for the raffle.
Yep.
That's about it.
Yep, we have 4 raffle items on the table.
I didn't record them, you know.
You can mumble at them as I talk, but don't get up. So I'll get started then. My presentation is going to be on app architecture, not the architecture components, as some people asked me apparently. And this will just be a broader app architecture. It won't go into specifics of things like model view presenter or model view controller or MVVM or so on and so forth. So this is going to be a broad overview, and then in future presentations, we can do those as toolbox talks, or full presentations. We can go over those in more detail about what MVP is or what MVVM is or how they differ. So the first question you might be asking is, oh, did just skip a, whatever. So architecture, you've probably heard a bunch of these terms, the MVVM, and wow, that is really blurry. Sorry about that. Dependency injection, Viper, MVP, so on and so forth. These are all part of architecture, but when you think about it, architecture is really just a set of rules that you follow for your application or your web service or your whole the whole system that you run off of. Now these rules can be pretty simple or they can be pretty complex. So an example is you already use MVP. Well, okay, sure. That's not actually a whole architecture. That is architecture for your view layer. Now layers is what we're going to talk about first. And in normal or most apps, you're going to have 3 different layers. So you might be asking, what is a layer? A layer is a categorization of functionality that you'll have within your app. And in a lot of apps, you'll have the data layer, which is going to be your network repositories, your network services, your APIs that you're interacting with, as well as your persistence layer. So your cache or your local disk storage that you'll have. And then in the data layer will combine those 2. So then similarly, you'll have the second layer that will be beneath it, and that will interact, that will be your business functionality. So in a lot of cases, or an example would be, you have a media player app, and you want to handle functionality for the next or previous or sorting or randomizing all the media. So that is business logic for handling that list. So that's going to be in your business layer. And then the layer below that is the view layer or the presentation layer that we're all accustomed to hearing about with MVP, MVC, MVVM, Viper, whatever your architecture is. One of the key components of doing layers is that your layers will only communicate with those that are directly next to it. So in the case of the view layer, it will never communicate with the data layer if you have a business layer. And there are some apps that won't have a business layer because they only show the data that is coming from the network, but don't actually perform any business logic on it. So likewise, your data layer won't communicate directly with the presentation layer. Now, the order of priority is very important, and you should only interact with the root components of each of these layers, and I'll go over those in a little bit more detail. But basically, that's what the in-app APIs is indicating, is each of these layers you will treat as an API that the other layers will interact with, so that they don't know what the implementation details are of that. So if they ever change, it doesn't matter. The rest of your app's not going to break. And if you make these really well defined, they'll be very robust and you won't have to maintain these layers very often. So the data layer, as I mentioned before, is really a combination of a couple of things. You'll have your network sources. A lot of times that will be your retrofit APIs or services, as retrofit likes to call them. And then you'll have your disk sources. So your room DAOs and managers, or shared preferences, or your actual disk storage for images. And then you'll have a repository that talks to those two, but those two will never talk to each other. So the repository will handle the logic of determining if it needs to read from the cache or if it needs to go and contact the network. Or vice versa, if it needs to contact the network directly, it'll push it through the cache down to your lower layer. So usually, if you have a cache as an example of a source, so it doesn't always have to be a cache, that should always be your source of truth. So you should not have cases where you're calling the repository and you're going directly from the network down into your app. It should be network to the repository, which will push it into the cache, and then it'll pull from the cache to push it into your app. That way, if you have any inconsistencies in converting from the network to the cache, that'll be consistent inside of the app instead of having some cases where it's coming through fine and other cases where it's not. And it was probably about a year ago now, Jordan Hansen showed a cheese shop demo that has a implementation of the repository pattern inside of it. So if you want to go see an example of what it looks like, you can view it there. Now, I do have to comment that this has changed a bit since that time, so I'm not sure exactly where the cheese shop demo has gone since then, but yeah. But the main idea of the repository and how it interacts with it should be the same. So we get to the second layer, the business layer. And as I was talking about before, this is the layer that you're going to have services in the sense of Android. So you're going to have like a media player service, but not the UI portion of that. If you do a foreground service, that'll, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. Or any task that you do. So work manager background tasks, or async tasks, or live data, or RX, or whatever the heck you're using. Thread pools, anybody? No? Really? Okay, that was a joke, don't use that. And those will be similar to the repository communicating directly with the provider, or whatever you choose to name it. I usually name them providers because it's a little bit different from repository. So this provider will have well-defined APIs similar to your repositories, and they should be very strict. So when you come into the provider, you should be saying, and same with repositories, every method is either synchronous or every method is either asynchronous. And you see this in examples of Google's like Firebase. Everything comes back as a task of type. And those tasks are by default asynchronous. So if you want it synchronous, you can go and modify that task and say, fetch whatever dot await, and that'll make sure that it's synchronous. But as far as your API goes, your API should be very strict on making sure those are the same, so that you don't go into a case of calling a method and not being sure if it's synchronous or asynchronous. Now, in some cases, if you want to use RX inside of your app or coroutines inside of your app, that can be pretty explicit in these APIs. So with RX, you can have a single or continuation or whatever, or with coroutines, you can have it suspend, which that's a different discussion. I'm not a huge fan of having suspend throughout the whole app, but either way, that'll make sure that anytime you call the method, you know if it's going to be synchronous or asynchronous, and make the rest of your logic that interacts with this pretty standardized and clean. And of course, you might not always have a business layer. And then the last layer that we are all, well, I hope we're all pretty well versed with it, is your presentation layer. The MVP, MVC, MVVM. In short, you should probably be using MVVM on Android, especially if you're using any of Google's like data binding components or their architecture components that will help the MVVM architecture pattern. MVC you really shouldn't be using on Android because it doesn't play well. And MVP is fine. So the difference, if you guys don't know, between MVP and MVVM is in well, the main difference, there's a couple different ones, but the main difference is in MVP, the presenter has knowledge of the view, and the view in terms of MVP, not Android's views. Whereas with MVVM, the view model does not know about the view. The view is pulling or linking up to the view model itself. So an example is if you have a live data in a view model, the view will go and register to that live data. Whereas with a presenter in MVP, the presenter will say view dot something equals this live data or whatever. So the quick explanation of MVP versus MVVM. So I've already gone over a little bit of this. There's layer cleanliness. So there's some acronyms in here that you may be familiar with or may not be familiar with. There's DAO, which is your database or data access object, your DTO, which is your data transfer object, and then your domain model. So each of these are usually associated with one layer. Or in the case of DAO versus DTO, they're both in the same layer. So DAO is, if you use Room, you kind of already know with it. It's the objects or the defined models that you're going to be using whenever you access your local data. So that could be a file. The file object is a, DAO, or in Room, they specifically annotate them as at DAO. And then DTO is your transfer objects. So whenever you make a network call, your objects are the transfer objects. So that's the DTO, and that'll be in retrofit, that's whatever return arguments or parameters you're sending along with your network requests. So why are these different? They aren't always different. I do recommend that within your architecture, they be separate for multiple reasons. A big one is if you're using retrofit with, say, Moshi, those both require annotations onto the, well, Moshi particularly requires annotations onto the transfer objects. Or if you're using Room, Room requires annotations on its model objects. So you don't want to have multiple annotations, and I'm not even sure if that would work to have multiple annotations from those different libraries on one object. Now, let's say you do get it to work, or maybe it does work, I don't know, I haven't tried it. Well, if your network object ever changes or your local access object ever changes, you've just broken that whole code. So you have to go through and have some workaround that says, in this case, use this, in that case, use that. Don't do it, just map it together. So when you go into your repository, when you pull down from your network classes, the repository should know, oh, I need to convert this before pushing it up into the persistence layer that you have on the device. And then you have your domain model. So this one, I go back and forth on where it should actually live. Most recently, I've believed that it should live in the data layer because it's a data model. But this is a third model that you're going to use that will keep your app from understanding what the cache implementation is. So in some cases, or in a lot of cases that I've dealt with, you will have a model that a view really wants to understand or know about that is a combination of a couple of different, let's say, database tables. So you can combine those into a single one that are then pushed through the repository instead of having to fetch multiple different objects and then have a knowledge of those throughout the app. This also helps insulate you from any changes into your caching mechanism, so that if you change, let's say, from a name of the object or reorganize your cache, it doesn't implement or doesn't affect the rest of the app. So it's a very clean API, as we've mentioned before. And that kind of goes back to the interface standardization. I already mentioned the synchronicity. So asynchronous or synchronous, choose one. Implementation abstraction. There's a couple different ideologies around this. For example, a lot of places that I have worked at have done interfaces for repositories and then implementations for those repositories. And to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because you're only gonna have one implementation of that repository unless you count test implementations, in which case you can just mock those with the mocking framework that uses reflection if you need to. So it just means that you're not changing the structure of your production code to support testing. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be test-driven in your development practices. You should make sure that whenever you call a method, it's going to have an input type, which could be nothing, and an output type, which could be nothing. Does everybody understand the idea of test-driven development? I see a few heads shaking. Yes? No? We'll talk about that another time then. All right, so we're kind of nearing the end of the presentation slides. I want to show a few things inside of Android Studio just to make sure that it's clear. But a couple of the things that I've kind of gone through, I don't know, oh, package structure. So rule of 30s. How many people have heard of the rule of 30s? Really, Jeff? I'm sure you've heard of it. Okay. So the rule of 30s, which, quote, rule of 30s, should be less. It's like rule of 15 or something, is that each package in your app should have no more than 30 subpackages. And each subpackage should have no more than 30 files. And each file should have no more than, well, no more than one class in it, by the way. But each class should have no more than 30 methods. And each method should have no more than 30 lines of code. Now, this is why I say it's a rule of 30s, and it should be less. Like that should be your maximum that you ever achieve. Because if you have 30 methods with 30 lines in it, that's 1,000 line long class.
I think detect, the default is 10 functions per class.
In
Detect.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Perfect. I like that. Oh man, I could go on a while for this, but yeah, just try to make your code clean. Keep it under like 10 methods, 15 methods. Don't make these, Jeff, I just saw that.
I'm going to go start counting.
Don't make these God classes where it's 2,000 lines long in a main activity that you have no idea where the function you're trying to find is, and you have to Control F to find it, or look through the method function list. This isn't architecture per se, but it's a way to make sure that your code is clean and helps you
Create a bunch of base classes, right?
Yes, you have a base
And another base, and then
that is another one that I want to talk about.
Composition over inheritance.
Yes, exactly. Composition over inheritance.
I think it's 3 is the default.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have an activity and you do a couple things with activities, then Android will hate that.
Yes. Yeah. Does everybody understand composition versus inheritance? Yes. Yes. I see no. Okay. So composition. Oh, we'll go over inheritance first because that's easier. So inheritance is what you get by default with Android and a lot of Vue frameworks, or pretty much everything in particular, where you extend something. So in the case of Android, your activity is you're inheriting the main activity or the base activity class into all of your activities. Same with fragments, so on and so forth. Composition, you still have inheritance in composition. There's no way to get around it. But composition is that any of that functionality that you would like to share among your classes is pulled out into its own object. And that comes along with like the single responsibility principle, where this class only handles one type of thing. So let's say it handles your backstack navigation because you don't like Androids and you don't like the nav component stuff or whatever. So that could be all put into one class that is not tied directly to any activity or application or fragment or views if you use Mortar, I think. But that'll allow you to test those components without necessarily having to go and test the main activity, so using the Android test runners. So you can mock a lot of that stuff out. It also keeps your classes a lot cleaner, and it's a single implementation. So you still get that with the inheritance, but you will get, if you do a large app, you will end up with a God main activity or base activity. Yeah.
Fine.
You have to have multiple of those.
It took me a long time to really appreciate that one.
Yes.
And notice how much easier it is to refactor.
Yes.
So much easier to refactor. And that's how I learned to appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, I don't know how to, like John, I don't know how to express my appreciation of composition over inheritance. It's hard to say what it is until you've actually played around with it. But you still don't understand what it is, look it up,
It's
or
like
come
saying a
talk to me.
car, you have a car, base class of a car, and then you have, some type of Ferrari, let's say. And Ferrari gets all those components of car. Well, you could do it that way, or you could say, here's a Ferrari that has some basic components, but also has 4 wheels, also has an engine, also has all these other things. That's the difference. But
It's more modular. Yeah.
yeah, it's much more modular. So when you have, so this is another interesting thing I found with this. When you have inheritance, usually you're going to be in the same package. But when you have composition, you can actually put those in totally separate modules and have libraries import those in. It's much easier to do it that way, and then you don't have to have a dependency because you can use dependency injection for that.
Great.
It's kind of complicated though.
Yeah, dependency injection is its own presentation or discussion.
Yeah.
Probably better as a discussion. So talked about rule of thirties, composition over inheritance, and should mimic. So this is in reference to the package structure. So the package structure in a lot of cases will mimic what your layers are. That can either be as modules, like project modules, or it can be inside of the application module itself. So if I exit this, go to Android Studio, and that's probably kind of small. Anybody remember presentation mode on this?
I think it's under view, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, should be good with my... Oh, that's not useful. Come in here? No? Oh, use that. Well, we'll pretend to... Can everybody actually see these? Is it kind of hard to see? Yeah.
Can you not do presentation mode?
No, presentation mode gets rid of that, though.
That's why you shift. Right? Yeah.
You get to the side.
No, let's see. Yeah, presentation mode just shows you the code editor. Are you trying to look at the structure? Is that what you're trying to show, Brian?
The file structure.
Yeah. But people, I think, at least I can see it.
Hey, this file manager. Show us.
Yeah. Where did I put this? Which did it address that way? Not really. I can't do that today. Okay, can you see that now? It's a little bit different, but same format. So if you don't know me, I like
You
the
can
directory
get
structure.
into their presentation of
Huh?
go up to the menu and show it from the menu.
In presentation?
And go up to the view tools
Oh.
for Windows.
Oh, hey. Perfect. Yeah. Nice. Okay. We'll use this then. So you remember the first few layers that I had? Spoilers. So we had data, the domain or business, and the view layer. So this is what I mean by the package structure will or can typically mimic what the layers are. So in this case, you have your data layer, which includes the disk or your persistence layer, your network layer, and your repository. And of course, these are all empty right now because there's nothing in it, and it's an example project. But under each one, so let's say the disk, you will have the implementations for the area that they handle. So let's say you have accounts. So accounts will be a package underneath the disk, which will be underneath the data. Now, similarly, on your network, you're most likely going to have something that deals with accounts as well. So you will have account on your network package. And then the third one is a repository, which is a sibling to the disk and network packages, which also has account and the other functionalities that you have within the network layer or the data layer. And it's going to be the same for the domain. I just threw in a super basic example there. It actually doesn't do anything. So you have the domain, and then media is just the area of focus that you have inside of there. So let's say you have an audio or video player, then you would have the media provider, which there's nothing in there, and I think it's the same with media service. Yep. And then, of course, the view might not be the same as your data model or your data, your data package. It is right in this project because it's a super basic example, but you'd have it more deeply nested for the actual functionality. So let's say for account, you have the authentication area where you either do a login or account creation, or maybe you have account recovery. Those would all be sub-packages to the auth package, which will be underneath your account. Same with a Meetup. You can have a detail view or a list view or request presentations or something like that. So those would all be functionality areas within your app that are broken down into the package structure. And same with the presentations. So if you have presentations, you can view the details of a presentation or the actual presentation or media or whatever. And then personally, I would probably throw like a main activity if I'm using like navigation components into most likely a main package. Or if it's the only thing, which it usually isn't, then I would just leave it as under the root view package. Any questions on this?
When you had your providers, your data layer, so
Yeah.
would you not allow your view to talk to your repository straight up?
So not in, so for the, oh, well, it's gone. So for the, oh, where is it? Domain media. So for the case of media, if I have media network stuff, so let's say I fetch a list and that,
Like playlist sort of.
yeah. So anything that's going to be interacting with these, yes, usually I will only have the presenter talk to the repository or whatever. And then
You have a
unless,
combination.
huh?
You have a combination of sometimes going to the repository, sometimes going to the provider.
Sometimes, yeah. But for anything that like your account stuff, you're most likely not going to have any business logic that's on top of that, so you can go to the repository directly. The idea with the providers is that they provide the end component or end objects that your view is going to interact with if you have any changes from the repository, from the data layer.
had troubles with naming. So if you're talking about, you're sending down a different object all the way down to your view, so that you
Yes.
don't.
Yeah, so usually I have been pushing towards separate project modules, especially with Kotlin, for those types of things. So the data layer,
So let's say I have a person in my
Yeah.
database, right?
Right.
But you're saying don't pass your person object all the way from your
Right,
domain
right.
all the way to your
so
view.
with Kotlin, and you can kind of do this with Java, it's just a little bit more difficult. You can do, in Kotlin, you can do the internal visibility.
Oh, yeah.
So it's only visible to that module. So you do that for your persistence layer and for your network layer. And then your domain model objects, those are public, the default visibility.
So you would create another person object that would be used for the view and a person object for your database.
Yes,
Wouldn't that be a little?
not always.
It can get tough on the data layer.
It can get a little bit tough, but a lot of cases that I've run into is that the person object that you will have from your, let's say the network, is not going to have, or may have extra fields that you don't care about within the app.
Yeah.
And so you want to make sure that those are stripped out. Now, the other thing, especially with the network layer, is you might have nullability inside of those fields to play nice with like JSON parsing libraries or whatnot, or even default implementations of, or default values for those fields that still doesn't play super nice with like Moshi or JSON or JSON or whatnot. So you want to keep those away from the rest of the app. Now it might be a little bit different with the database objects. If that's exactly what you want, then sure, that can be your
tend
domain
to lean
model.
towards going with, you love, creating views.
Right.
And so you pass down view objects down to your view. And so that way you're not dealing with the core database object, and your database core tables can change, but yet your view objects can be the same.
Right.
And I don't have to deal with the issues of naming of my core, tables and things like that. And then anytime we do DTOs, we would preface them all with DTO.
Right.
That way we clearly know a DTO from a domain object.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I usually do some, account DTO and account DAO to indicate that it's a transfer object or access object.
Yeah.
And in some cases, yeah, sometimes I will omit like the DAO part of it because I know I'm just going to push that down for now. And then when I want to change my database access or file access or whatever, then I will rename that one and create a new one that is going to be the same API.
He's a bear.
You had a question, sorry.
I was just double checking that you're saying you encourage us to name the modules matching the layer that they are?
Yes. So your data layer, your domain or business, if you wanted to call it that, and then you have your view layer or UI.
I agree with it. I was just double checking.
Yeah, okay.
I had conversations with people before and I knew it was a good idea to do it. I just had no argument to tell them why it was a good idea.
Right.
Kind of
When you get to big projects, it is incredibly helpful to go,
Right.
where in the world is this
Right.
stuff?
And on big projects, you actually could split this out into different areas. So you could have the whole stack where it's the 3 different layers for accounts as a module. And then let's say like a book as another module, stuff like that. I do have to worry you about doing multiple modules. Bye. Right now, multiple modules, the more modules you get, the slower your builds will be.
We have not found that to be the case. Well, a full build, yes. The incremental build.
Even incremental, because with Kotlin at least, because the Kotlin compiler does not correctly abide by the oh crap, I forgot my name.
We just refuse to.
Yeah, but are you gonna run into it's gonna be a nightmare if you have a big project.
No, what we do is we have about 10 libraries.
Yeah,
So
and
we split all this stuff out and say, okay, you compile outside of the project altogether.
right, and that is another path that I really do recommend.
Our builds are really fast. We have, about 20 apps, and they all share these things right here in our apps built
So, but then you run into problems when you gotta debug something that spans between three things, and you need to step through it all.
Oh, yeah. You can actually, even though it's not a part of your project, you can dive right into that code and you can debug right into that code.
There's also Gradle tricks that you can do that will pull all of those sources in as if they were in your project, and you can modify them and even commit them. But that's
So we didn't find that, I mean, we did it all with Gradle and didn't find that it would like rebuild everything. I mean, they would,
We don't have one project that has all the libraries. We have, each library is a project of its own, and it's compiled and maintained on its own. And those are all dependencies put into our main other projects.
Great.
And you can debug right into them, and it tremendously improves the performance. Like all of our UX stuff, all of our icons, and all of our shared UI pieces are all in the UI kit type of library. And so every time I build, I never have to build that thing. It's already pre-built, ready to go. But totally can debug. And if I have to fix some code, we do have a thing to make it so I can make the correction here, locally deploy it to my local Maven repo. And then I can, that way I don't have to commit it up and deploy it to some central and everything.
So I think that with the multiple modules, you might not have any issues if you aren't using Kotlin in all of these modules. Because it's a
it was all Kotlin.
because it's a particular issue with the Kotlin compiler that it doesn't always recognize a binary as unchanged, and so it'll go and say it needs to rebuild it.
I'll look into that. Oh, that's interesting, because
Yeah.
it was 2017 we moved. Because the Ancestry app, the main app is rather large.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of stuff in it. So we've actually moved it to modules. And now there's a file limit, how many files you can view have changed.
Yes, there's in
We broke the limit.
Android Lollipop, by the way, too. They changed it in Marshmallow, but in Lollipop, there's 100 dex file limit. So each module that you have is going to do a dex file, and unless you do ProGuide, which you don't want to do when you're debugging or in development. So it has 100 dex file limit. So if you do a lot of modules, you're not going to be able to debug on Lollipop without running ProGuard, which kind of defeats the purpose of running develop.
We found it easier to grow. If you're going to grow your mobile team into multiple teams,
Yep.
much easier when you have modules.
Or if you make everything a library, like the
Yeah.
ICS group at the church.
So that's a good example of composition then, of
Yes.
having separate libraries that
Yes.
are all by themselves,
Yeah.
reusable.
Great. I can show an example of composition, but I don't really want to. You can go look at my playlist core library, and there's composition for you. All right, this is all I have. Is there any questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
So we talked about composition over inheritance, but I think in some cases we should necessarily use inheritance over composition. It depends on the case, I think. So for instance, let's say you have a navigation drawer or a bottom navigation bar. You want, it would be wise to put that code in a base activity and then extend that activity. Unless you want to add all those.
Well, if you're using a navigation drawer, you should be using fragments instead of additional activities, and same with the bottom nav. You shouldn't have multiple activities that are going to have the same drawer or the same bottom navigation in them. Why? Because you're going to have flickering on all of those components whenever you swap out, and it comes into the case where you're going to have inheritance forced upon you because you decided to go down this one path instead of following along the path that Google's trying to push you in, to where you have the composition where you only have one activity that handles those, and the fragments are what communicates with the activity to tell it what it needs to do for those. But yes, there are cases that I can't think of right now where inheritance is strictly required.
When there's an easy relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree with them. I think it's all in balance and in good, appropriate taste. Like, back to the car example, a Ferrari is a car. A Ferrari doesn't have a car. It is
Right,
a car.
right.
But
So-
a Ferrari might have a spoiler where a car wouldn't have a spoiler. So
Right.
I think you just
No, there are
do it
definitely.
appropriate.
So inheritance in that case is, yes, it is very telling of what it is, It's kind of part of the type system that we have in Java. There's other languages that don't rely on inheritance because they're duck typed. So if it has the functions that are same as these functions over here, then they're the same, even though they don't inherit each other. So that's part of just coming down to the language that we're used to. But yes, that is a good example of it. And then the composition part of that is, you know, the engine, spoiler, and wheels. And stuff. But no, very good points. Cool. Any other random comments? Jeff, I can see it.
What if I don't have a disc?
Well, you need to go to Best Buy.
It's a random comment you asked for.
Yeah, just as part of your instructions for starting up in the app, tell them to go to Best Buy and buy an external hard drive. Perfect. Yeah.
If you have lots of modules, you could set up Gradle files to pull them all together.
Yeah.
Without pulling them out of a repository. They're all built in the same Gradle project.
Yes.
Because if you're relying on a Gradle repository to fetch them from, that's a really painful way to deal with.
As far as the Maven repos go, it should
No,
be
just day-to-day development. Even though your team may not be responsible for it, you're still building it locally instead of pulling their output from a repository.
well. If your team's not responsible for it, you shouldn't be building it locally.
I guess it really depends on how hands-off you are on the other project. It's easier to build that way. If you want to
Probably depends on your
make a
team.
change, find out what happens, and then submit a pull request for it.
Oh, yeah.
You could set up your build file to do that, have the change and submit it to what
Right.
the team's responsible for without.
Yeah, and if you're doing modification in those very often, yeah, that is definitely a much easier way to deal with that type of thing. But in a lot of cases, it still does slow down your build. So it's trade-offs, but it does make more sense. And I've done it before. I'm just not on a project right now that requires it.
We actually had our setup, we had it so we could tweak it and either pull it and build it or just suck the library in. So most of the time we weren't building, but if there was a problem and we could identify it was in that actual thing and they wouldn't respond, we'd tweak it, it would pull the source code in and we'd build it, and then we can submit a thing. But most of the time we avoided trying to build everything because it's actually more.
Yeah, no, that's. Yeah, I'd be really interested in how you were doing that.
It was kind of ugly, but it worked.
That's a lot of solutions.
But there was just a flag, we could just go in and say, I can't remember, we just had a thing that said, want source, and then we would, rerun the Gradle, and it would change the dependencies and go pull it.
Using a Gradle property, if it's set, it uses implementation, pulls it from the repository. If it's not, it uses the project syntax.
Yeah, we basically had two, we had our own section that you could either pull the source or pull the library, depending on what the flag was set. And most of the time, we didn't pull it.
Yeah.
But that avoided the
Yeah,
thing
that's
of always having to build everything.
Have another way
We built binaries.
have it both ways.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. That's a cool solution.
I've got a question. You typically find yourself doing your asynchronous threading stuff in the domain layer.
Nope, it's all in the view layer. I mean, when you think about it, what is the layer that really cares if it's synchronous or asynchronous?
I mean, with Android, it's always view,
Right.
because you have to worry about.
Right.
So typically in the view model, then you're wiring live data or.
Yep. Okay. If you have questions, find me.